Naomi Starro did not correct him. Not when Leland told the table she had no head for numbers. Not when the laughter moved around the room like something he'd sent it to do. Not when Mrs. Cavendish, their hostess, smiled with the polite exhaustion of a woman who had witnessed this particular performance before and understood that acknowledging it made everyone, including herself, complicit in it. Naomi set down her water glass, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked at the chandelier above the table with the patience of someone who had learned that composure was the only currency left to her in that room. She was 27 years old. She had been composing herself for 4 years. The marriage to Leland Starro had been arranged in the spring of 1884, when Naomi Hurst was 23, and her father's shipping firm was listing badly enough that everyone in Charleston could see it. Hurst Maritime had run well for 30 years under her grandfather, less well under her father, and not well at all since the dock fire that took 2 of their 3 freighters and most of their contracts. Leland was 36, the son of a cotton merchant who had spent 2 decades building the Starro export firm into one of the most recognized names in South Carolina trade. He needed a wife from a respectable family. He needed the Hurst name, which still carried social weight, even when it no longer carried financial certainty. Naomi understood the arithmetic. She had never pretended otherwise. What she had not understood until she was inside it was how thoroughly a man could share a house with a woman and never once see her. Leland was not cruel. That was the particular difficulty of him. Cruelty would have been easier to hold, easier to name. He was simply absent, present in every room and absent in every way that mattered. He spoke to her when the occasion required it. He kept the household supplied, the accounts settled, her clothes appropriate to her station. He brought her to dinners and took her arm in the street, and called her by her name with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had long since stopped wondering about the person behind it. When their acquaintances asked how she was getting on, he answered for her. The dinner at the Cavendishes was a Tuesday in September. The comment about numbers came because Mr. Cavendish had asked Naomi, directly and with genuine curiosity, what she made of the new cotton pricing reports out of Georgia. She had been about to answer. She had been composing her answer for the better part of 30 seconds when Leland turned from the man beside him and said it. "My wife handles flowers and menus. The rest she leaves to those who understand it." He had not meant it as a wound. That was the other difficulty of him. He simply meant it as a fact. She did not look at him when he said it. She looked at the chandelier. Then she looked at Mrs. Cavendish. Then she looked at her plate and thought, with the quiet, clear-eyed certainty of a woman who has spent 4 years watching and saying nothing, that she knew more about cotton pricing than anyone at that table, including Leland. She had spent 4 years reading every document that passed through their house, because no one told her not to. 4 years of dinner conversations about shipping lanes and broker contracts absorbed through the particular attention of a woman, with nothing else to occupy her mind. 4 years of understanding, piece by piece, the architecture of a business she had never been invited into, but had never been able to stop studying. She knew, for example, that the Starro firm's Liverpool supplier had been late on 3 consecutive contract deliveries. She knew this because she had filed the correspondence herself, because Leland left papers on his study desk and never once considered that his wife might read them. She knew that the delays had cost the firm 2 American buyers who had moved their contracts elsewhere. She knew that Leland had borrowed against the warehouse to cover the shortfall, had taken the loan from a man named Dorsey at the First Commercial Bank, and had not yet told his business partner. She knew all of this the way she knew everything in that house, completely, silently, and entirely alone. Augusta Pelham came to call the following Thursday. She was 54 years old, had buried 1 husband and outlasted 2 business partners, and operated the most profitable textile importing firm in the Low Country from an office above a hardware store on King Street, which everyone agreed was not a suitable location for a woman of her standing. And no one said to her face. She had been at the Cavendish dinner. She had watched the exchange at the table. She did not offer sympathy. That was the first thing Naomi noticed. She sat in the front parlor and looked at Naomi with the direct, calculating attention of a woman evaluating an investment, not a woman extending condolences. "You were about to say something," Augusta said, "before your husband spoke." "I was," Naomi said. "What were you going to say?" Naomi told her. Not the polite version, the full version. The Georgia pricing shifts, the reason behind them, what it meant for firms already carrying debt against future contract yields. Augusta listened without interrupting. When Naomi finished, Augusta was quiet for a long moment. "Your husband doesn't know you know any of that," she said. "My husband doesn't ask." Augusta looked at her steadily. "The Starro firm is in trouble, not a question." Naomi said nothing. "I have my own sources," Augusta said. "I'm telling you I know so you don't have to decide how much to tell me." She folded her hands. "The Liverpool supplier, Clement Dorsey at First Commercial, holds the note on the warehouse. If Leland can't service at that note by December, Dorsey calls it in. The warehouse goes. The firm goes with it." Naomi looked at the window. The morning light was very flat. She thought about 40 men who worked that warehouse. She thought about her father's name still on the original articles of incorporation, which no one had ever bothered to remove. "What is it you're actually here to tell me?" Naomi asked. Augusta looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly that question. "I'm here to tell you that Clement Dorsey was defrauded by the same Liverpool supplier 2 years ago, through a different firm. He's been looking for documentation ever since. If someone gave him correspondence establishing a pattern of deliberate breach, he might restructure the warehouse note rather than call it in. He'd rather have a cooperative creditor than a defaulted one." She paused. "What you do with that is your own business." She left shortly after, without telling Naomi what the right decision was. Naomi had the strong impression this was deliberate. She spent 2 evenings in Leland's study. He was at his club both nights, which was usual. She worked through the Liverpool correspondence systematically. Letters, shipping manifests, invoices against delivery, the gap between what was promised and what arrived. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman who had been managing household accounts for 4 years and had a precise mind for the relationship between numbers and what they revealed. She wrote it out in a clear factual document. No opinions, no accusations, dates, amounts, discrepancies, referenced against the original contracts. She added 2 pages on the warehouse note. What the firm could service monthly under the current contract structure, what restructured terms would look like, what a realistic recovery timeline was. She did not show it to Leland. She did not tell him where she was going. She went to First Commercial Bank on a Wednesday morning in October, in her best day dress, and asked to see Mr. Dorsey. His secretary looked at her with the expression reserved for women who arrived without appointments and without a husband. She gave her name. She said she had documentation regarding the Liverpool freight contractor and the Starro firm's warehouse loan. She said she was prepared to discuss a restructuring proposal. She was made to wait 40 minutes. She waited. Clement Dorsey was a careful man who had been in banking long enough to know the difference between someone performing competence and someone who actually possessed it. He read the document she had prepared in full without speaking. He asked 3 questions. Her answers were precise, referenced, and entirely free of apology. At the end of the meeting, he said, "Mrs. Starro, this is the most organized account of the Liverpool situation I've received from any party." He paused. "Your husband doesn't know you're here." "My husband," she said, "believes I handle flowers and menus." Dorsey looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile. "I'll want to review the original correspondence. If it holds up, I'm willing to discuss extended terms." She had the originals delivered to his office by Friday. She did not tell Leland. The restructured note arrived at the Starro firm's address 3 weeks later, addressed to him. She watched him open it at breakfast. She watched him read it twice. She watched the confusion cross his face. The terms were better than anything he'd managed to negotiate on his own. He assumed his lawyer had handled it. He didn't ask. She let him assume. She had no interest in his gratitude. What she had was Augusta Pelham's office on King Street, where she spent 2 afternoons a week for the next 2 months, learning the importing business from someone who had been running one for 11 years. The partnership agreement was signed in January. Pelham and Starro, Augusta's name first, because she had insisted, and Naomi had not argued. She was not proud. She was practical. Leland found out in February. Not from her, from his lawyer, who had heard it from someone who had seen the firm's name on a textile invoice and looked twice at the second half of it. He came to her study on a Thursday evening. She was at her desk. She did not look up immediately, because she was in the middle of a figure she wanted to finish. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him. "You went to Dorsey," he said. "I did." "Without telling me." She set down her pen. She looked at him. He was not angry in the way she might have expected. He was something quieter and harder to read, the expression of a man who has discovered that a room he thought he understood has a door in it he never noticed. The warehouse note was going to be called in December, she said. 40 men work that warehouse. My father's name is still on the articles of incorporation. She held his gaze. I had the documentation. I went. That was my firm, he said. Yes, she said. And I saved it. She let that sit for a moment. You told a room full of people I had no head for numbers. I assumed that meant you didn't need to know. He said nothing. He looked at her with the stunned, recalibrating expression of a man who has spent 4 years looking at someone and seeing one thing, and has just been shown that the thing he saw was only the surface. She did not press it. She did not need him to understand fully, or quickly, or in any particular order. What she needed was in the ledger in front of her, and in the signed agreement in the cedar box on her shelf. The firm will do better under the restructured terms, she said, not unkindly. If you want to know why, I'll explain it. If you'd rather not, the quarterly reports will show you in time. She picked up her pen. Either way, I have work to finish. He left. She went back to the ledger. Augusta held a dinner in March. Small, deliberate. 8 people around a table in her office building's upper room, which she had furnished with the cheerful defiance of a woman who had decided that suitable was less interesting than useful. She introduced Naomi to the other guests, not as Mrs. Leland Starrow, not as the wife of anyone, but as her partner, with the brisk, unremarkable tone of someone stating a plain fact. It was the first time Naomi had been introduced as what she did, rather than who she had married. She sat beside a cotton factor from Georgia named Tilghman, who spent the better part of an hour talking to her about the Georgia pricing reports, the same ones Mr. Cavendish had asked about in September. She answered everything he asked. He did not look surprised. He looked interested. The difference was significant. When the dinner was finished and the guests were near the door, Augusta appeared at Naomi's elbow. He's going to ask to correspond with you directly, she said quietly, nodding toward Tilghman. Say yes. I know, Naomi said. She had already decided. The spring brought 3 things she would remember clearly afterward. The first was the Georgia correspondence, which became a business relationship that expanded into a contract that tripled Pelham and Starrow's importing volume within the year. The second was the Starrow firm's first profitable quarter under the restructured terms, which Leland attributed in the newspapers to his own strategic patience, and which Naomi did not correct, because she was too busy to be annoyed, and the accurate version was already in the ledger, where it mattered. The third was a girl named Priscilla, 17, the daughter of the woman who handled their billing. She appeared in Augusta's office one afternoon and stood in the doorway with the look of someone who had something to ask and was working up to it. Naomi saw her first. Come in, Naomi said. What is it? Priscilla looked at her boots. I've been doing the accounts for my mother, in the evenings. A pause. She doesn't know. I found 2 errors in last month's billing. We've been undercharging by almost $30. Naomi looked at her. She thought about the dinner at the Cavendishes. She thought about the Georgia reports she had been about to explain when someone spoke over her. She thought about what it would have meant if someone had looked at her at 17 and simply taken her seriously. Show me the errors, she said. Priscilla came in. She showed her. The errors were exactly as described, and the method she had used to find them was clean and logical and entirely self-taught. Naomi corrected the billing herself and hired Priscilla that afternoon. Augusta, who had watched the exchange from her desk without appearing to, said nothing until the girl had gone. Then she looked at Naomi across the room, with the particular quiet of someone who has watched something they expected and found it consistent with everything they believed. You're going to be good at this, Augusta said. I've been good at it, Naomi said. No one asked before. Augusta made a sound that was her version of agreement, a brief, precise exhale, and went back to her own work. Leland came to the King Street office in June. He stood outside for a moment before entering, which she knew because she saw him from the window. He stood on the street and looked at the name on the door, with the expression of a man reading something he has known was coming and finds, now that it is fully visible, harder to absorb than he expected. He came inside. He sat across the desk from her desk in her office, in her firm. I owe you an accounting, he said. She waited. Not for the warehouse. I understand now what that cost you, what it took. He stopped, started again. For the dinner, for all of them. For 4 years of, he stopped again. The particular vocabulary of a man who has lived inside his own certainty long enough that he has very few words for the moment the certainty goes. You had a precise mind, he said finally. I knew that. I chose not to look at it. She looked at him steadily. She thought about the girl she had been at 23, sitting in her father's parlor, while two men discussed the terms of her future. She thought about what she had believed then about patience, about making herself small enough to fit the space she'd been given. She thought about how long it had taken to understand that the space itself was the problem, not her. I know, she said. That's the part that would have mattered, if things had been different. She held his gaze. They weren't different. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both understood that. The firm is doing well, she said. The quarterly projections look good. If you want to understand the restructuring model, Thomas at Dorsey's office can walk you through it. She paused. What I've built here is mine. That's not a negotiation. She picked up her pen. But you were never my enemy, Leland. You were simply a man who didn't see what was there. That's its own kind of loss. He stood. He put on his hat. He looked at her one more time across the desk, with the full, late comprehension of a man who has finally read the document he should have read 4 years ago. Goodbye, Naomi, he said. Goodbye, she said. He walked out. She listened to the door close. Then she went back to the ledger, because Priscilla had flagged a discrepancy in the March cotton weights that needed to be reconciled before end of week. The name on the door read Pelham and Starro. She had chosen to keep Starro. Not for him. Not for the marriage. Because she had built something under that name, and the name was hers now in a way that had nothing to do with him. She had filled it with her own work, until there was no room left in it for anyone else's definition of what she was worth. She opened the ledger. She picked up her pen. There was still a great deal to do, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life than the knowledge that she was exactly the right person to do it.